Okay, so let's talk about social media a little bit. So I did a long piece about social media and regulation as, you know, town square, public square sort of situation because of the market share that some of these social media platforms have gained, and you know, maybe it goes beyond just enforcing terms of service, or maybe it doesn't, and what's sort of best for the individual, what's best for society, all of this different stuff. To get us into that piece of it, Tim, my view fundamentally is that private companies have to be allowed to enforce terms of service, assuming that the enforcement of those terms of service is not discriminatory on the basis of the protected classes that you and I just spent 20 minutes talking about, and I guess mostly agree with. That's my starting
But they're
point.
exempt.
Okay,
they're exempt.
Well, not, give me an example.
Yes,
So
they
you're
are.
talking about Washington,
Yes.
right?
No, I'm straight up. Twitter right now has the right to ban any protected class. Twitter can say, you know, we're not going to allow any Asians on the platform. Boop, and they can't stop.
My reading of that so I know that there's court testimony that you tweeted, which I reviewed, and I reviewed the context of that and some legal opinions. That's not the opinion that I came away with. The opinion that I came away with is not, and let me see if I'll distinguish it the way I understand it, and then you tell me if I'm maybe misunderstanding it. My reading of the test, and this may be getting sort of too in the weeds for some in the audience, maybe not, but we'll give it a shot. My understanding of the testimony that you linked me to is that it is not that Twitter could say as a policy, we do not allow Asian people on our platform. I've seen no serious legal opinion that that is something Twitter would be able to do. My understanding is that if there is a type of speech that Twitter identifies that would disproportionately wrap up Asian people, that is something Twitter is asserting would be legally acceptable.
In terms of in terms of that particular testimony,
yeah.
But as we know from the motherboard piece, at least one employee said they use an algorithm to sweep up to target ISIS, which actually sweeps up innocent Muslims.
But that's exactly the point I'm making, which is that's not them. Twitter is not saying as a policy we don't allow Muslims. They're saying we have a policy to target ISIS, which is mostly made up of Muslims, which will trigger some false positives.
So I guess the challenge then is, are we enforcing rules at a policy level or an individual level? If someone
I agree. We completely. That's a key question. But I don't want anybody to think that what you're asserting, unless it is what you're asserting, is that. Yeah, go ahead.
So let's dig into it.
Yeah.
What is the Twitter public accommodation? That you can say something and it will appear in reverse chronological order to those who subscribe to it.
Right.
Right. That is the public accommodation. According to civil rights law, you cannot restrict a public accommodation based on protected characteristics. If someone quotes a verse from the Quran, Twitter can remove that.
Okay, you're saying at the individual level or through an algorithm that is meant to identify ISIS members?
No, like a Twitter employee has the First Amendment and Section 230 right to say anything pertaining to this protected class we can remove, because Twitter is a speech platform.
But that's the thing. So here's where I think, and I don't know if we're talking past each other or if we actually disagree about what the policy is, or if we're just misunderstanding what the policy is. What I'm saying is I have seen no evidence, nor any legal opinion, nor have I seen Twitter say that they believe they could have a policy that says, we do not allow, for example, Jews on Twitter, and that would be legal.
So let's try and bring it to the real world.
Okay.
The way you're describing it would be that McDonald's says, no, you know, Jews are allowed in the store. We just refuse to sell them cheeseburgers. You see what I mean? The point of Twitter.
I'm not sure that that's the right analogy.
So let's check it out. Twitter is a platform where you can express your thoughts.
Okay.
You can go on and you can. Otherwise, what are you really doing? Nothing. Like that's all Twitter does. Twitter has a First Amendment and Section 230 argument where they say, whatever it is you say, we can remove it for any reason. And the judge asked, are you saying you could remove someone even if it would be discriminatory based on religion or gender? And the response from Twitter's lawyers was yes.
Right. So that I think you're misunderstanding that testimony. And there's a page that follows it, or a sequence that follows it, that I think is very illuminating. I'll just give an example, and maybe the analogy will allow us to move forward on this. Imagine that Twitter wants to. I mean, let's just take the one from we were talking about earlier. Twitter wants to enforce a ban on anti-Semitic content. Okay, let's imagine that that's something Twitter decided they were going to do. Anti-Semitic content on Twitter is not equally balanced between men and women. We don't even have to argue about what the split is, but we would just agree it's very unlikely that it's 50-50 or 50.3 and 49.7, the way that men and women exist in society. Anti-Semitic content on Twitter is not evenly balanced between right-wingers and left-wingers. An ADL study says 71% is right-wing. Number doesn't matter. You might disagree with the number, but let's just imagine it's not evenly distributed. What Twitter is asserting is, if indeed 71% of anti-Semitic content comes from right-wingers, we are going to be disproportionately removing the content of and banning conservatives or right-wingers or whatever term you want to use. Twitter is not saying we would legally be able to say, no, imagine that they're white conservatives, just for our argument, because we got to add a protected class. Twitter's not saying if we wanted to ban all white conservatives from Twitter, we would be allowed to do it. That would violate a very specific non-discrimination law. What they are saying is that if the practice of removing anti-Semitic content disproportionately targets people who happen to be white, as long as we're not removing people for being white, that is legal. And I agree that that's legal.
That's a really interesting, that's a good point. That's a really good point. What we're seeing now, I think, with the digital space is that we've actually got a distinction between people as thoughts and the thoughts related to certain characteristics and identities and the individual themselves and their identity. Because I think by your explanation, and again, I think it's a good point, Twitter couldn't actually ban someone for being gay because they're banning the speech specifically, right?
No,
like
well,
if someone, so I'll put it this way.
Yeah.
If someone was gay and made a post talking about the things they do as a gay person, Twitter could ban them, right?
Well, I mean, I guess if they had a policy that said what, that you can't talk about gay things, I don't know.
No, I'm saying, like, from a legal standpoint, based on the First Amendment argument that Twitter's under no obligation to support the speech of anyone else, right? So,
I guess so.
if you're saying, so let's, Twitter does have a policy that bans hate speech, which means because, like you said, it's predominantly coming from one side, they predominantly get banned.
Yeah.
And we're speaking hypothetically because I don't know the numbers, but for the sake, it's again, I think it's a good point. It's something I hadn't realized. There is going to be a distinction between the individual's identity and the ideas. The ideas don't have an identity.
Right. So are you agreeing that you asserting that Twitter claims they can ban people on the basis of protected classes was not an accurate reading?
I think you're correct, but I do want to clarify. I think what we're actually seeing is that there are certain ideas associated with identity politics.
Yes.
And that Twitter has the ability to remove ideas around certain groups that are specific to that group. For instance,
I agree.
Right. So this is a really great distinction. This is fantastic. Twitter's not going to say, hey, you're Muslim, you're gone. Like, let's say a Muslim guy says, I'd like to order pizza. And they say, ha, you're Muslim, you're banned. What they're actually saying is the ideas associated with the Quran, that verse in particular, we're going to remove.
Okay. Right. And it will disproportionately impact people who are Muslim.
Right.
Yeah. I think there's another important distinction here, which is whether this is being done algorithmically and people are being caught up in false positives versus whether Twitter is saying as a policy, we are going to proactively remove Quran verses that relate to pizza or whatever example you had. I mean, I think that's an issue because when you go back to Twitter said, we have to be careful about algorithmically removing white nationalist content because, like you said, a lot of Trumpists use similar language and we're going to end up removing Trumpists who, I mean, I guess aren't white supremacists. I guess maybe if they're using the language, maybe they are. I don't know. They expressed a concern about that. That is an algorithmic false positive.
So I think the argument made by the Twitter employee was that a lot of white nationalists will use like the Pepe meme as well, and they'll do like the OK hand sign. But a lot of Trump supporters will use similar, like, I think MAGA is the easiest way to put it. You absolutely are going to have white nationalists saying MAGA. Sure. And then if the algorithm detects that overwhelmingly people who talk about these issues also have this hashtag, it will start grabbing innocent people, right?
That would be interesting. I think the more relevant example is the opposite, though, because so many people use MAGA that it's very hard to imagine that Twitter would execute a policy of banning anyone who says MAGA and it'll accidentally wrap up some white nationalists. I think a better example, Tim, and tell me if you disagree, would be that there would be some kind of phraseology that it's mostly white nationalists using, which some Trumpists that are not white nationalists might use. And it's the Trumpists who would accidentally get banned, because what you're describing would be a policy that would actually be targeting Trumpists that would accidentally impact white nationalists. Twitter's saying it would be the opposite.
Oh, I see. Well, it was I think it was it James Woods maybe, who posted the Christchurch Pepe Clown World thing.
I'm not sure.
Like
I don't follow him.
James Woods found himself using, yes, an overt white nationalist meme, and I don't think he knew what it was. So, you know, I think that probably is a good example. They would have been like, get him out of there. But it's, you know, some of these things, I don't know. You have an argument on the left of whether or not the OK hand sign is actually like a white supremacist hand sign.
Right, but that's not the relevant argument when it comes to the legality of what Twitter's asserting it can do, which I think is the more important thing. I mean, yeah, the left can debate, you know, the right can the right can debate whether referring to money as shekels is implicitly anti-Semitic or not. The left can debate whether the hand sign is or is not. But the more important thing to me is I want to make sure that we're not putting out false information about what Twitter is asserting they could legally do.
No, I think you did a good job when we kind of clarified that. I think, you know, a lot of these debates come down to perspective, right? I'm looking at a 6, you're looking at a 9, but I will say, I think it's fair to say what we've kind of concluded is that Twitter isn't banning someone for being a thing; they're banning for ideas pertaining to a thing, right?
That's based on the testimony you sent me that I read. That's my interpretation.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
So I guess my concern is, should we protect the ideas pertaining to being trans, for instance?
Like that was going to be my next question, which is, okay, given that we've established, we had sort of like part pre-A of the conversation was what are Tim Pool's politics? But once we got past that, we got into what is our sense of protected classes and non-discrimination law? Then we got into what is it that we believe Twitter can currently legally do, and what does Twitter seem to believe they can currently do? The next question is, does there need to be policy change, and what should that policy change be? And doesn't it get into the very overt government intrusion into private businesses? I don't know the answer. I guess we have to start thinking about it.
I'm not opposed to the government stepping in when changes need to be made. You know,
but what would we want the government to do?
So this is a serious challenge that has a lot of questions that have to be answered. I don't know all the answers. What I do know is you have a large group of people in the mainstream who believe certain things and a large group of people in the mainstream who believe the opposite. Misgendering is the best example. Now, there's a lot of people who think, you know, they try and mischaracterize my argument that I'm trying to argue in favor of people being transphobic. No, absolutely not.
Yeah, to be clear, to my audience, let's give Tim the full good faith benefit, whether you believe he's earned it or not. And I'm not implying he has or hasn't, but because this is his first appearance on my channel, let's assume that his argument is only what he claims it is and not read more into it. Okay.
Ben Shapiro has one of the top podcasts in the world.
Okay.
He has a massive following, and his views are considered to be mainstream. I disagree with like the good majority of his views, but I recognize that in order to bring about sound policy in the direction I want, we have to champion over those ideas through politics, through debate. Well, Ben Shapiro believes that misgendering isn't a thing, that if someone is born biologically male, they're a he, and if someone is born biologically female, they're a she, etc. Twitter has a rule specifically that you can't do that. That you have to use the pronoun someone requested. So the most notable instance would be Meghan Murphy. And I'm not going to get into, for those that aren't familiar, she did have some tweets which talked about people specifically, but she had one tweet that was in response to an argument about the 1950s where she said, men aren't women, though. And she was suspended from Twitter for that.
Okay.
Whether you agree or disagree, I think it's important to recognize the left believes respect the pronoun and the right says don't respect the personal pronouns. If Twitter has a policy in place that restricts what you can or can't say, it disproportionately affects conservatives who are engaging in a mainstream perspective.
Right. So I guess what I would say is what we've discussed so far in our conversation seems to be, number one, we agree, and it's not whether I see a 6 and you see a 9. We agree that political orientation is not a protected class. That part we agree with.
But this gets us into a bigger question.
Well, we'll get to the bigger question, but let's handle it at the micro first.
So I would say no to that.
It's not a protected class. Good.
No.
Oh, you're saying it is a protected class?
It is. Yeah, in DC it is, which means...
Well, okay, but most people don't live in DC, right?
But it doesn't matter. Should a national company have to abide by local jurisdictions for those jurisdictions?
I think it would be an impossible standard for a company that is a multinational company to be expected to abide. I mean, as a practical matter, it seems impossible to enforce or expect something like that to be enforced.
They already do it. Twitter already enforces per jurisdiction.
On the basis of IP address.
I believe the answer is yes. I don't know how they enforce the laws of other countries, but they do.
And what if you signed up for Twitter in DC but are tweeting from Arizona? Which law gets enforced?
Probably Arizona, I'd imagine.
And is that
But
based
it, but
on, what's that
but
based on?
this is one of the biggest civic challenges I think we're facing
Yeah.
is these companies are in a digital world, so it's hard to know at what level we can actually enforce these things. I
Okay.
honestly, it's
But I
challenging.
guess so the question then becomes one of regulation, right? If Twitter's terms of service are, I mean, okay, let's take it, let's build it back. So we started at the top with an example and we're going down. Let's just for a second, as a thought experiment, reverse it and build it from the bottom up. Can businesses exist that have perspectives on how transgender people are treated within their businesses? Is that acceptable legally?
I actually don't necessarily. I think the answer is yes.
Yeah,
Am I
I think
wrong?
the answer is
Like,
yes. I mean, I'm not asking rhetorically.
actually,
I think
no,
the
no, I'm
answer is
sorry.
yes.
I'm sorry. The answer is actually no in many jurisdictions. The answer is actually
Explain that.
no.
What do you mean?
There's been the new human rights laws that are emerging around like in New York, Philly, New Jersey, and now with the Equality Act. I don't know specifically about the Equality Act, but I do know that at least in New York, you cannot take self-expression into account for how you have your business. So what ends up happening is any new build can't have a men's or women's room. They can't create special circumstances for people based on their identity, and literally identity as a whole. It could be anything. You could be a furry. You could be whatever. So they're making neutral bathrooms, just single rooms with no markings on them for everybody.
But let's see if we can maybe boil it down to a specific example. David Pakman in Boston, Massachusetts. I have a company. I've got 100 employees, and I've got an employee handbook, and my employee handbook says, here is the policy for time off. Here's how you request vacation. Here is how tardiness and absenteeism will be handled. And as a matter of policy, we refer to people with the gender pronouns that they request. Would there be anything legally problematic about that?
I think the answer is no, because that actually falls under civil rights protection. But again, I'm not a lawyer. I
Right.
think
But the
business
point is, I would be able
obligated.
to establish my business as long as I'm not violating anyone's, as long as I'm not, violating protected classes, I would be allowed to do that.
Actually, again, I'm not a lawyer, but I'd argue under a First Amendment argument is the answer is no. You can't make someone speak.
Oh, I'm not making anyone speak. I'm just saying that as a matter of company policy, we refer to people on the basis of the pronoun that is associated with their gender identity. That I'm not forcing anyone to say anything. You can sit there at your computer and write emails and not talk to anybody. It's just a company policy, right? I'm just saying that's the policy of the company.
If you don't enforce it, I mean, it's actually a tough question. I'm not a lawyer. I wouldn't be able to answer.
I mean, I guess what we're building to though is, at a certain point, if it's not violating someone's status as a member of a protected class by intent, as we already talked about, intent and impact are sort of two different things. I don't know legally how we tell Twitter they can't have a policy on how people should be gendered.
I think it's an issue of developing the civic and figuring out where we draw the line. And I think you disagree that Twitter should, and I think the line is probably in a different place.
I'm not even sure, honestly. Like, I totally get your point, which is, what about accidental misgendering, right? Like, I mean, I think that creates more, even more. I think the gendering on Twitter thing is an edge case, and I resist sometimes the instinct to get drawn into edge cases as representative of the whole. But even within this edge case, what about accidental misgenderings? I mean, I don't know.
People have been banned for that.
Yeah, that may be. I don't know.
Yeah, there was a post that went viral where someone responded to, it was a cartoon avatar, because just like people do that. And they said, dude, comma, listen, X, Y, and Z, A, B, and C. And they got suspended for misgendering for saying dude. And dude wasn't even meant to be, gendered. It was meant to be like a gender neutral, like exclamatory.
Yeah.
Actually, one really fascinating thing we're seeing with the backfiring of a lot of these laws is there are now certain, like anti-SJW types that have asserted pronouns in their profiles to get people banned who refuse to use it. So it's weaponizing it.
I don't know about that. And again, I feel like once we get into the way people misuse policy or take advantage of edge cases, I don't know that that's how I would be making policy necessarily. I think we kind of got to what, for me, the crux of this stuff is about the legality of it, and about, at a certain point, do we want social media platforms regulated as if they were government entities? Because that's eventually kind of the key question, right, Tim? Like, do we consider these to be public square entities that should be governed in a different way?
We do have some rulings already. There's two. There was one specifically about Trump. You can't block people because you've created a public forum.
Right.
And so he still has some people blocked, to my understanding. The other was, I believe it was called like Peckingham versus North Carolina, where the Supreme Court recently unanimously ruled that the government cannot constrain access to online services because it's where people get their information, do commerce, find jobs. And to do so would be a restriction of, individual liberty. You'd have to read the exact ruling, but they essentially said social media is the new digital square. And because of that, no law can be passed in this country that would take someone's right to this platform away. So we're getting there.
Yeah. And now remember, Tim, there is one thing, there is a caveat there, which is passing a law that takes away someone's access to the platform is sort of one standard. That would not preclude the removal of specific pieces of content, even if they disproportionately affect particular groups of people. Like, do we agree that these are different standards?
Well, I brought this ruling up specifically not to say that they're going to do something, but that the Supreme Court's personal view is that social media is a public square. So there's no restrictions or on platforms what they can or can't do yet. But the opinion of the Supreme Court is that it is the digital public square. So I think we're really close to getting regulation. Texas, California, and Florida have already proposed them. Florida's failed. Texas is based on if a platform says they're neutral, but they're not, then they have to there's a remedy for that. I don't know. I think it's the AG sues them. And then with California, it's a shocking law. It just says straight up, any social media site based in California can't restrict someone for political affiliation or the political content of what they post.
That would be exactly what we're talking about. That would be sort of government saying, even though this is not a protected class according to the Civil Rights Act or the non-discrimination, any of that, these are additional government provisions, which I think if someone is a small government conservative, so to speak, they should probably be opposed to it, right?
And most of them are actually.
Oh, they are. Okay, yeah. I don't talk to enough of them to know.
They are, but a lot of them are for regulation because I think, for the most part, one thing that, it's a big group of people with varying ideologies. Some of them are kind of centrist, center right, and so they're going to be for regulation or whatever. And a lot of them are going to be laissez-faire, never. And I am not laissez-faire. So for me, I think we face a big challenge. Donald Trump is only on Twitter. When he tweets something, it affects the world. For a private company to say, you don't get to stand in front of this man or respond to him terrifies me, right? Because think about this. Someone could tweet to Donald Trump, you're an effing blah, 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 blah. And Twitter can be removed. I don't like the idea of a private company telling me I'm not allowed to yell at the president. But the issue here is the scale. If Trump were going to a different venue and I got kicked out of one, I'd be like, well, I'll go to the next one and tell him he's the C word. But if there's only one place where he's at, and the private company is using their authority to basically dictate what you can or can't, that terrifies me.
Sure. I think that the counter side of it is not that I'm steel manning, and the anti-regulation crowd, but there is a sort of perspective that businesses should not be regulated by the government. That they shall not be regulated by the government beyond what is deemed absolutely necessary. And then it just becomes a debate over whether what you're suggesting is absolutely necessary. And then that's a mess. And I don't know where we
opinion.
Go.
But here's the thing, right? Let's forget the conservatives.
Yep.
Are you familiar with Mathic Media?
No.
So Mathic is always going to get a shout out from me. They're anti-war leftist, pro-Bernie, anti-intervention, but they receive I think their company is half owned by Ruptly, which is Russia Today.
Sure.
So they got suspended by Facebook, and they didn't break any rules, and they were suspended for I think a week and a half, and it was because CNN reached out to Facebook, said, "Hey, did you see these guys are funded by Russia?" Waited until Facebook took them down. And then CNN publishes this story. Gotcha. We found the Russian media.
Right.
Another example is Twitter removed 2,000 pro-Maduro accounts. I'm not saying you should be for or against Maduro, but when these things fly under the radar, I think because the left isn't as tuned in, the right is tuned in heavily. It's like Donald Trump's tweeting
I
about
don't
it,
know
right?
that I would like to see evidence for the assertion about who's tuned in, because I think that, making any kind of broad claim like that, I would want to be super clear on where that's coming from. Sometimes people pay
Well,
attention to something and they don't
sure.
comment. So, I think there's different ways to
All
measure
right.
that.
But
I think the
at least,
question though is, were the accounts removed because they were pro Maduro? If
yes.
so, I mean, again, I don't even think there's anything illegal about that. We can argue it should be illegal, right? Which is what you and I are
Right.
talking about.
Exactly.
It's not currently illegal.
Oh,
But I
yeah, I
would be
agree. It's not
curious what the
illegal.
content of the messages were, because it's possible. I just don't know enough about that
According,
particular incident.
Twitter referred to it, I believe, and again, Google it. They said something like it was interference or governmental interference or something, and I believe they were quoted as saying, though they didn't have direct evidence, something like that. I don't know the full details. I just know that what I end up seeing is the anti-war left, people who essentially oppose the machine in various capacities,
Mm.
are excised. Excuse me. And it's going to happen that CNN's already laying the stones against Bernie. You know what I mean? They had all those people at the CNN who are working for these lobbying groups. I
Yeah.
don't like the idea of the massive machine restricting access to the new public square. It may be that I'm in front of the market. I'm a very technological individual. I was in the hacker community. So I think maybe the things I'm seeing are more alarming to me because I'm like watching them develop, but it maybe hit the mainstream. But rest assured, they're going to ban everybody arbitrarily if they have the power to ban everybody arbitrarily, and that includes somebody who wants to call Donald Trump the C word.
That may be. I'm curious. I mean, the type of regulation you're describing that would apply to Twitter or Facebook, for example, should it be also applied equally to the content on websites like Reddit and 4chan?
So, well, they're different sites, and this is the
No,
big
I know that
technical.
they're different sites. Yeah.
I just mean to say, like, the structure of the algorithm and how they function is different.
Yes.
And there's a serious challenge, because I'll say this too. I believe that if right now the U.S. government said, Supreme Court unanimous, Twitter can no longer remove people for hate speech or whatever, Twitter would probably like just fall apart.
Okay.
It's gonna get overrun by the nastiest insanity. You can't do anything about it. But
It's
I
possible they might also roll out, better moderation tools where people can control what it is that they're seeing. I mean, I think they would manage. I don't think it would be the end of Twitter.
No, I mean, like, if they weren't allowed to moderate based on legal speech, it
Right,
would be
right.
really
No,
bad.
the idea would be there might be abandonment because it becomes such a horrible experience for a lot of
Right.
users. But I think they'd roll out
Exactly.
moderation tools that users can use for themselves.
Oh, yeah. Well, then maybe, isn't that a good thing?
Oh, those tools are good no matter what. I have thousands of people muted. But my question is, I know that Reddit and
Me too.
4chan, I know Reddit and 4chan are different websites, but what I'm saying is, would you apply the same type of government intervention regulation to them?
It depends on what the government regulation is, because it might have to do with certain technological aspects. So, and again, let me try and clarify. Twitter is a reverse chronological system with a default algorithmic system. Algorithmic versus reverse chronological is going to have entirely different laws. So Twitter's algorithm chooses who to put in front of you. All right. So that you can't regulate who they're promoting. Reverse chronological, you can say it's got to be this way.
Sort of. I mean, don't you have? I'm trying to remember. I'm spending less and less time on Twitter, but on my Twitter app, I have the option of seeing the sort of what's called like the curated feed. But I can press a button telling it that I don't want it to make judgments, like show me low quality tweets, show me everything sort of thing. Maybe that's not 100%, but it seems like there's elements of both on Twitter.
No, you're right. You can easily switch between the two.
Right.
So the issue would be, like, I think YouTube's an easier example. When you go to youtube.com, it shows you 15 videos. You might have 1,000 subscriptions.
Sure.
So YouTube has to choose who you're going to see. That's promotion. I don't think YouTube's under any obligation to promote your content.
Okay.
In terms of your subscription tab, however, it should notify you that the person you're following has a new video, and you can choose to click it and go to their channel.
Fair.
So algorithmic versus reverse chronological, very different. If I say I follow you and I want to see your tweet when it happens, and that's how the system works,
right?
And we put a regulation in place, it would be specific to that feed, which is part of the challenge.
Yeah, but again, so I mean, on Reddit, you can hit the new feed, which will show you reverse chronological, or you can hit the hot feed, which is a sort of popularity-based algorithm. So again, it seems like the difference you're pointing out that is making you fall short of saying Reddit and 4chan should be regulated the same way is not really that much of a difference. So, I mean, if you don't think Reddit and 4chan should be regulated the same way, that's a totally legitimate position to take. I would just want to know that.
I think in terms of so Reddit isn't an algorithm. What gets upvoted is based on what the community chooses to push forward.
Yes, although there are always questions as to whether that is a complete representation of what the community is voting for, or whether Reddit is influencing it. But in theory, that's what it is. Okay.
I mean, yeah, if people don't vote, what do you do? Like, we want to encourage them to vote. If they don't, that's what they get. In fact, I believe it's called the 1% rule, that 1% of users on Reddit are the ones making the content go to the top.
Sure.
99% just absorb it.
I mean, I think that's the same on Twitter, though, because most people don't like, reply, or retweet tweets that they read, right?
It's true. No, you're right. You're right.
Fair.
I got to be honest, though, man. I really, I can see these problems. I don't think I know how to solve them, but I do feel like...
No. I'm just wondering, like, if there's something that you think is uniquely different where you don't want 4chan and Reddit subjected to whatever regulation you do favor for Twitter.
So regulation will have to be specific based on technology, but they should all be under the same constraints.
Right. Okay. Very fair.
I don't no special privileges for anybody, but again, acknowledging, 4chan isn't an algorithmic system. It's just based on when you comment, it moves to the top. So the difference I'm trying to make, I guess, is that YouTube chooses the winners and losers, and so does Facebook. You can't regulate that. Facebook is under no obligation to promote me to anyone.
Right.
If I have a page, you can go to it if you want to. Right. So it's different. It's tough. I don't know. Unless someone chooses reverse chronological feed. I don't know.
Fair enough. Okay, well, listen, I mean, I don't do these like 4-hour streams where we continue beating a dead horse. What I like to do is, this is a really good initial conversation. I think my audience and I now have a better sense of sort of where you stand, and I want to think more about these issues. But I think that this has been very, very interesting, and one of the, I mean, political differences aside, because we have them, I hate doing this stuff where I pretend like it's all about the marketplace of ideas, and every idea deserves the exact same amount of time. I'm not for any of that bullshit, as you know, but I do think that if we can have actual productive conversations about important issues, even if we have political disagreements, that's still a good thing, and hopefully the audience agrees with that.
Oh, hell yeah, this is what we need to be doing, man. And I want to point out that when the point you made about it's the idea, not the identity, is extremely important, particularly for me, and I think for the conversation, because I think that is being lost, right? The idea that we need to separate the ideas from identity, right?
I think we do. I think we absolutely do.
That's fascinating, actually. I'm going to think on that one.